and cultural strategy. Oh, recording is in progress. Maybe I'll have to re-record that story because it's a good part. And Carlos, I will talk to you about that later. So, my story, I craft that in service of a more just world. And at Race Forward, I've been here for 11 years. And the reason why I have done that is because I believe in my heart our vision and what it takes to get there. And so Race Forward, we actually recently celebrated our 40th anniversary, 40 years of building towards a just multiracial democracy, free from oppression and exploitation, in which all people, including people of color, thrive with power and purpose. And so a little bit about how we see change. How do we create change? We need to grow power, recognizing that power is rooted in people most impacted by systemic oppression, and harness that power to transform policies, institutions, and whole sectors. So for us, it's not about just demanding change, it's about growing, cultivating, and leveraging power to pass, implement, and sustain that change. And the piece that's crucial to all of this, which Jane and I are talking about today, is how we transform culture. So culture is where people find community, they form identity, and express their values. Culture is the realm of ideas, images, sounds, movements, and stories that we are immersed in every single day, whether we are aware of it or not. And so I take a cue from author and cultural strategist Jeff Chang, who often says, quote, "Politics are where people are some of the time. Culture is where people are at most of the time." And so in our work, we ask, how do we uplift and intervene in the culture to make equity and justice, including housing and economic justice, both popular and deeply felt across a range of audiences? How do we use all the tools at our disposal, whether in the work of campaigns that I imagine that many of you are doing, but also journalism, the arts, local civic groups and social circles. I'm talking about sewing groups, fantasy football leagues, fandoms, etc., to underscore what we call narratives, right? To lift up narratives about equity and justice, to, as I said earlier, make them deeply felt and popular. And so we're going to share, as I said earlier, a little bit about what we've learned, some terms, some examples and ways for you to begin doing this work in your campaigns or in your organization. And so in the time that we have, we hope that you take away a little bit of something around narrative and cultural strategy. And then at the end, begin to think about, okay, well, in what ways are we already doing this? In what ways could we begin to integrate a deeper practice of narrative and cultural strategy? And then we're going to have about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So I'm thinking about 10:15 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to hope to end there so that we can hear from you all. Okay, so I'm going to keep on going and talk about our context. And for us, this is critically important for us to understand in order for us to harness narrative and cultural strategy for equity and justice. We know that our history holds the key to understanding our present political conditions. And I say that precisely at a time where certain politicians and states across the country are trying to censor that history, ban books that talk about it. And so at Race Forward, we heed the words of the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who says that we are in the midst of a third Reconstruction. So that first Reconstruction, that was at the end of the Civil War, after slavery was abolished. There were collective gains from that first Reconstruction that still reverberate, like equal protection and natural-born citizenship. And I name those things because I specifically have benefited from them. And at that time, faced with a multiracial coalition of newly freed Black people and propertyless white people that threatened their power and wealth, powerful interests in the South cleaved that coalition. This was a backlash moment which manifested in the era of lynching and Jim Crow segregation. That was the first Reconstruction and what the backlash looked like. The second Reconstruction, this was during the Civil Rights Movement, an era in which Black people fought for formal equality under the law, resulting in the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all key pieces of legislation that not only helped people of color, but also other historically marginalized groups. And then, of course, backlash again. Faced with a federal government who was tasked with enforcing these laws, powerful interests used racialized tactics to divide and conquer. They did that by spreading the false narrative that government is giving handouts to quote unquote undeserving, quote unquote criminal people of color. This narrative was core to the Southern strategy, and I'm sure many of you know what that is. And this backlash, what did it result in? Massive criminalization of Black people, the dismantling of many public programs in the name of preventing full inclusion of Black people. And with any public program, it wasn't just Black people that were harmed. So too were white people that depended on those public programs to survive and thrive. And so now we are at a third Reconstruction, approximately 60 years from the second and 120 years from the first. It's funny how things happen in cycles. And this third Reconstruction, particularly thinking about the last 4 or 5 years, when ideas about equity have finally arrived at our institutions. So it's not only community-based organizations that are saying we need and demand equity. Now we have philanthropy, we have local government, we have advocacy, thinking about, okay, well then how do we think about not just our policies, but our practices? How do we make equity a reality, right? Not just a demand. And so this moment, and I do say the past 3 years specifically, that was supercharged because of the work of Black organizers and leaders who catalyzed the largest racial justice uprising in the country after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and more. And so only 3 weeks passed until we saw the beginnings of a coordinated backlash against this third Reconstruction, just like the backlash in the second, just like in the backlash after the first. And so we saw Christopher Rufo, then a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, launch a highly coordinated and resourced culture war on critical race theory, which has now expanded this year to encompass gender ideology and wokeness in general. And this has resulted in chaos and tumult at school board meetings, town hall meetings, on local media, and a host of other platforms and venues, both physical and digital. And we've also seen a raft of educational gag order bills limiting the teaching of history and core concepts related to race, gender, and sexual orientation, as I said earlier. And so in this backlash moment, powerful interests are dividing us yet again by making politics about identity and cultural erasure. And so rather than focus on the underfunding of schools, for example, they focus on critical race theory and gender ideology. Rather than focus on access to healthcare, we focus on whether immigrants can get care. And the list goes on and on. This is a divide and conquer strategy. And so what's the purpose of this division? One, to roll back the progress we've made on equity. The purpose is to cast this work as divisive and to chill this work. The culture wars today are also meant to consolidate power amongst the political elite. These attacks on equity have focused mostly in suburban and rural areas, areas that are experiencing rapid demographic change and thus are primed for division. They do this to win state legislatures, the same legislatures who have moved forward voter suppression laws and state preemption laws to stop local progress on equity. And they are the same legislatures who are moving us dangerously towards minority rule. And lastly, they divide us to dismantle and privatize public goods. And what do I mean by that? Public schools, public parks, public infrastructure from our roads, water, and lights, public libraries, public healthcare. And so if we were to think about schools for a minute, public schools, as Christopher Rufo says, this culture war, whether it's critical race theory or gender ideology, it's about creating quote unquote universal public school distrust. So in other words, the purpose is to paint public schools, or quote unquote government schools, as the far right calls them, as spreading wokeness in order to scare parents to abandon public schools altogether. They create a boogeyman to distract and divide us for their own gain and have us abandon public goods like public schools. And it is precisely these public goods that should create opportunity for all, regardless of race, religion, or background, that actually connect us to one another in a democracy, that should increase health and well-being for all. And so this is the political context in which our equity work is operating, in which our narrative and cultural strategies are operating. And we need to understand this. They didn't just battle in single issues or through facts at us. They created compelling narratives to stir up fear and resentment, coupled with attacks on government as a way to win power and wealth for the few and shrink public goods, shrink government. This is core to the story of the scarcity that's been designed and implemented. And we need to lift that up. And so fear and resentment, we know how this plays out. Janet said it earlier, othering, right? Whether it's people of color, Black folks, immigrants, LGBTQ people, they are the threat, not a billionaire class that's picking our pockets. Attacks on government. As I said earlier, you spread narratives around government only serving those people over there and not us. And then they use that all again to consolidate power and shrink public goods. We need to understand that this is the far right's oppositional narrative. In order for us to harness narrative and cultural strategy to win our dream of a just multiracial democracy in which we are interconnected, in which we understand that equity is in our collective benefit, as Heather McGhee says when she talks about what she calls the solidarity dividend. And so with that, some terms, I talked about the political context, and now we're going to move into, okay, well, what do we do? What is narrative? I've been saying those words a lot. And with that, Jane, I pass the baton to you, and you just let me know when you want me to advance slides.
Yes, I'll give you the quick next slide. Hey, everybody. Wow. So I want to acknowledge that, what Dennis shared, that political context, it's a lot. It can feel really daunting, right? This is generations in the making, these counter narratives from our opposition, right? Well, I guess dominant narratives from our opposition. And it can be really hard to think how we actually begin to deconstruct and challenge them, right? How do we exactly fight back? Well, facing political pundits, certain national leaders who, whenever we try to do any kind of racial truth-telling, healing injustice, call it harmful or racism, right? We need to, as a collective, make popular and to be felt in our culture narratives that elevate our shared humanity, our shared fate, our interconnectedness, right? Narratives that affirm that tackling racism and other forms of systemic oppression is in service to all of us, in service to our community health and safety, in service to our souls, and benefits everybody. We got to make these kind of narratives a part of our culture. So yeah, what is narrative? Next slide, Dennis. All right. So I'm gonna say narrative a lot, but I want y'all to think of values, right? Which can also feel amorphous. So I want to share a metaphor from cultural strategist Liz Mann. Think of stories and messages that are part of your campaigns, whether it's a talking point you've created, whether it's a story about people impacted by housing injustice like homelessness or substandard housing conditions, right? Those stories and messages are like stars. You can think of narratives like constellations of those stars and culture as the galaxy. In order to navigate and make sense of our vast galaxy, we arrange those stars into constellations. We arrange them into narratives. So think of narrative as the tools we use to change the culture. These are not just like simple or singular stories and messages. These are stories that are arranged purposefully, aligned purposefully to hit certain notes, right? That hit the same narratives over and over and over again across time, across many voices and many forms. That in of itself is narrative strategy. Next slide, please. All right, so on the screen, we have a tool, a pyramid, a triangle, but it's a tool. And this narrative pyramid is one that we use both for narrative design and analysis. It's also a tool we can use to create and advance shared language. And it also can be a diagnostic tool to ensure that our comms work actually is aligned with our narrative work. We could also use this pyramid as a learning guide, right? To help us actually see the 4 elements of narrative. From the very top, deep narrative, to stories, and to messages. And so right now, let me just walk through what each element is and how they're aligned to give us impact, a deep scale, and stickiness amongst our target audiences. All right. So from the very bottom, we have messages. And I'm sure y'all are very familiar with them. We're bathing them all the time, thinking about ads that may be floating around. And these messages reach the most people, and there can be many of them operating at once, right? They're how narratives are interpreted. But, messages, are very ephemeral. They're fleeting. They don't really stick in our minds. So they have limited efficacy in creating change. They don't make sense without the context of an underlying narrative. Above message, we have stories. These are special. Stories you could consider as being the basic unit of change. Why? Because these are much more sticky in our minds. I'm sure right now you could think of a childhood story. You might not have all the words, but you remember, the overarching story and can tell somebody else it. Stories are what convey context, values, ethics, and worldview. Through the arc of a story, following the protagonist and antagonist from beginning, middle, and end, we learn who we are and what our society deems to be important. But just like messages, they also can, not make much sense without an overarching narrative. Above stories are narrative. Again, when I say narrative, think of values, such as everyone deserves safe and healthy housing, right? Everyone doesn't believe that. We might in this room or virtually, and our goal is to get other folks on this bandwagon of believing this. Narrative and culture too is epistemic, right? It's how we know what we know without having to always give all the research, all the details. Narrative offers meaning, not true for fact, but a point of view. It gives us purpose and direction. Narratives can be transmitted pretty rapidly once they get traction, right? Take on a lot of depth, but only when folks can actually see themselves reflected within those narratives. If they can't, they'll reject them. And then above narrative are deep narratives. Deep narratives encapsulate our innermost visions and ideologies that guide our perspective on the world. They guide our understanding, our behavior, and our politics. You may also hear terms like core narratives, meta narratives, or frames. We use this pyramid tool here to take our minds outside of the fast-paced, short-term campaign focus, rapid communications here and now, right? And bring us into looking at the larger arc, the bigger picture of the short term, the midterm, and the long term. What exactly are we trying to say? So deep narrative in that sense is that long term, the world we're trying to build, while narratives guide us in the direction we want to go. Next slide, please. All right. So when, aligned together, deep narrative, story, and message, you get a greater impact and stickiness among your chosen audience. And this goes in either direction, right? From top to bottom, bottom to top. And we should be upfront that, there are many, many narratives out there, some by us, some by our opposition, some that are, mixed up mismatches of that together, right? All operating at once, fighting each other. That kind of narrative abundance is the reality, for better or worse. And we encourage you to not limit yourself to just one narrative, but make sure that your narratives, whether it's one or multiple, are aligned and complementary if you actually want to win. Okay, so next slide. I have 2 examples I'll share. I mentioned it right now that, your opposition, folks who don't want housing justice, have their own narrative strategy. And so let's look at one example that isn't about housing, but does touch upon it, right? This one's on poverty and how our opposition divisively frames it, right? So that in society, we think about it in the most, maybe not inhumane ways. So from the very bottom, thinking about messages, welfare queen, right? This term came to prominence in the late 70s going into 80s, really trying to cast Black women in particular, but also other women of color as being these takers. And it came from certain political leaders, certain business leaders, right? It became pervasive. It was in all their talking points. Above that, you have certain stories. And these stories didn't just villainize Black women and other women of color, but it also juxtaposed them with stories of individual triumph, right? Those like rags to riches stories. Think like shows such as Lifestyles of Rich and Famous or Cribs. You can make it if you just try, right? And these stories, messages affirm narratives such as anyone who works hard will succeed, right? And so therefore, if you're poor and in poverty, you're not trying hard enough. You're just lazy. It also affirmed narratives such as, your tax dollars are being misused to give handouts to those who don't want to work. And we even hit our now during the Great Resignation, right? These folks quitting their jobs, they just don't want to work. Not entirely true. And this narrative is underpinned by deep narratives of meritocracy and personal responsibility, which don't sound on their face as bad things, but given the historical and political context, right, are actually dog whistles for othering other people. Our framing of poverty, right, was set by a narrative alignment that really saturated our popular imagination to the point where people say welfare queen and don't even really know where that term came from, even though it has really clear racial implications. This highlights how narrative can be aligned for good or for even nefarious ends. Next slide. Okay, so now this one here, this example to show you both, the framing of our opposition, but also how we're able to subvert those narratives of our own that uplift a better future. On the left side, you can see narratives, stories, and messages from the opposition on marriage equality, right? They focused on, messages such as, on narratives such as, values of tradition, wanting a normal marriage, how gay marriage would threaten that, instability, and how this, then flowed into stories about, marriages between a man and a woman, right? What was the line back in the day? Marriage is between Adam and Steve, between Adam and Eve, right? It was repetition. And over time, it gained traction. On the right, from our side, you saw stories that really centered on equality and inclusion. We want to uplift, commitment and love. And our stories then flowed from that. What's really important to note from this figure is that, for the marriage equality movement, we had to move talking about, rights, talking about love and commitment. By doing that, we're able to activate folks outside the policy space, activists, storytellers, cultural workers who are able to, bring to life people's actual lived experiences, right? Think of shows such as Will and Grace, The L Word, and Noah's Ark. Think of, popular reimaginations of what love can look like, right? Showing that, queer and nowadays even trans couples, are among us, have been here and are deserving of love and a family, right? That along with the policy fight, changed the tides and got us to marriage equality, just showing how important it is tapping the culture, not just the policy. And with that, Dennis, I'm gonna pass back to you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for walking us through those examples. And we'll just say, I do know that I imagine that the screens are a little small in that conference room. And I believe you should have a copy of the slides in your packet. And if you don't, then we're going to make sure that you have a copy of this after our talk today. I know we're walking through a lot of examples. And so Jane just walked through deep narrative, stories, and messages, and showed that when you get alignment on those things, when your stories and messages are hitting at the same narratives over time across many voices and forms and sectors, that's how we change culture. That's how we make abundance and interconnectedness and dignity and safety deeply felt. And I say some of those values here, these deep narratives, interdependence, dignity, and safety, because these are the values that we, through our work, most currently with the Butterfly Lab, which was a narrative design lab on immigration, that is what we have designated as the deep narratives that undergird that fight. So interdependence, for example, this reality, this belief that no one stands alone and that we have a responsibility to one another. And that is a counterpoint to individualism. We also name abundance, which you all explored. And I talked a little bit about the historical context of that when we are in the right relationship with one another and the earth, there's plenty to go around. Belonging as a counterpoint to othering, that we recognize and respect the diversity of our communities, and so on. And we found that these values here, these deep narratives, they weren't just inherent to immigration, but they were resonant across all of our equity work, whether it was housing, economic justice, or education. And we realized that these values are intrinsic to many indigenous cultures, not just the cultures of different tribal nations across this country. And I would also say, when I take a look at these deep narratives, these values, they were also intrinsic to the queer community that I was politicized with. Those were the values that helped us move from survival to be able to thrive. And so, as we've been continually saying over and over again, how do we make these values, these deep narratives, felt, right? Emotionally felt and popular amongst our key audiences, people that may not actually be tuned into politics all of the time, right? But they're in your neighborhoods, they're in your counties, and we need to reach them in order to build an enduring majority for equity and justice. And so this is a little list that we are going to gift to you. And it is not an extensive list, but it is an ideation of what Race Forward through our projects have created. So we do work on public education, we do work on immigration, and we've worked with leaders on the ground to identify, okay, well, if these are the values and deep narratives that undergird our work, what are the narratives that we need to continually hit over time through our campaigns and even between campaigns, right? And so for us, it was really important to do that, understanding history, that we were battling a certain set of narratives that were incubated over 60 years, as I said earlier, right? Narratives like meritocracy or us versus them, a zero-sum game, right? That there are winners and losers if one group gets ahead, or this idea, this pernicious false narrative that wokeness is a threat, or that the market can solve all social problems, as we're seeing in housing and in our economy, or this idea of big government, right? And so on the other side, and what you'll see on this slide, whether you see it in your packet or on the screen, one of the narratives that we are insistent on making sure that we are hitting across our issues, across our campaigns, is one, the freedom to thrive. That when we take collective responsibility for one another, we all have the freedom to thrive. When we invest in public systems that build opportunity for everyone, when we make them more equitable, we all can thrive. Shared fate, and that's very similar, that we are in this together. An injury to one is an injury to all. Equity, the solidarity dividend, as I mentioned earlier, this is borrowed from author and activist Heather McGhee. When we join together across our differences and use equity as our central practice, we all collectively benefit. This narrative, systems drive outcomes. This is one that when I think about Race Forward's 40-year history, this is what we've been trying to make popular and have, that systemic racism is real, that there are a set of laws and institutional policies and practices that are driving inequitable outcomes, and we need to make that visible. This one, we still have a lot of work to do. Drained pool politics. And this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of our history, divide and conquer. Certain leaders are distracting and dividing us by using race, gender, and sexual orientation to win a political agenda that harms the vast majority of us. Public goods. When we work together and invest in strong, equitable public systems, as I said, that creates abundance, that creates opportunity. And they have been under attack for the last 60 years, if not more. And this last one, government for the public good. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. That it is not just the problem, but it is also the prize. It is the way in which we steward public goods. And so for us, these are the narratives, again, as I said, that we're trying to uplift across voices, forms, and sectors. And we invite you to interrogate this list and see of your campaigns, of the work that you're doing, which narratives are you uplifting? Which ones do you feel that you need to, even more so, given the political context? That is the work. And so a little note on narrative and cultural strategy. You've been hearing us say both narrative strategy and cultural strategy. And I just wanted to offer you a definition to help you understand these terms in your head. So narrative strategy, as Jane walked through, it is the deep narrative, story, and message, and making sure that those are aligned across all of your work, right? And so cultural strategy, what that simply means is that you are centering artists and storytellers and cultural workers in being able to lift up those narratives. That's simply what it means. And so, and we'll say, Jane, we have about maybe like 8 minutes left.
I know.
I know, I'm just like live facilitation, y'all. Definitely wanted to go through those terms, but now we want to segue into a little bit of praxis. And this is where Race Forward and other organizations that do this, we're here to help. If this is something that you want to integrate into your work, this is what we do. It is both an art and a science. And with that, I will pass the baton to Jane.
Thanks, Dennis. And I'm going to try to be swift so we have time for questions. So to hop in, 4 things, 4 steps, right? You want to know your audiences, know your narratives, orient yourself in a narrative ecosystem. I'll define that in a second. And you want to actually create and catalyze stories and messages that uplift your chosen narratives. Next slide. All right. So audience, and I'm sure you all have heard the term before, you know what an audience is, but within this context, you want to actually be really clear on who it is you are talking to, right? Who do you actually want to activate with your narratives and the stories and messages flow from it? You want to know, what drives them, how to reach them, and how to move them. In particular, you want to focus on 2 kinds of audiences, your base and your persuadables. The base includes people who already agree with you, right? To some extent. This can include, us here who are change makers, advocates, activists. And our goal is to empower and activate our base more fully to act in the ways that we need and to lead others, persuadables, to do the same, right? That can be coworkers, families, friends, neighbors, fraternity, sorority, brothers and sisters, everybody who they know in their networks to activate them and so forth and so forth. Persuadable audiences are people who, are sort of on our side, but aren't sure, right? And our goal is to convert them into our base. And often we got to, flex new muscles. We got to do new research to understand, reach, and activate them. Unless it is an explicit goal, we don't actually want to focus on our opposition, right? If you want to drown them out, if you want to call into question and ostracize them and their views. So really focus on your base and persuadables unless you are deeply trying to get, and move your opposition, which oftentimes most folks really aren't. So ask yourself, who is your base? Who are your persuadables? What types of stories, can reach them and how? Who influences them? Who do they actually trust? Thinking about entertainment and news and media, where do they actually get their news from? Or, thinking about culture, are there certain artists, certain, influencers that they may follow? Think about those kind of things and tap into it. Next slide. Narratives. As Dennis already shared, there are some that you can elevate, and we definitely encourage you. These are ones that we see as being vital to a just multiracial democracy. And so you should ask yourself, what narratives, if not these, or on top of these, are you fighting for when it comes to housing justice? What are you actually trying to uplift? Be very clear on what it is you want to convey, because some folks might, not get it at first, and you have to keep finding ways to reiterate it so it's clearer and more salient. Next slide. All right, so a narrative ecosystem. So we keep saying, things you have to do, but it's not just you, right? A part of our work is to actually build networks of recognizable people, groups, organizations that can immerse our target audiences in narratives that normalize and bring forth racial and housing justice. And we do this over time, right? Across many voices to change and advance our culture. This can be local artists, it can be a youth influencer on TikTok, it can be journalists, a public housing agency commissioner, a scholar activist, a tenant organizer. It's a variety of people, right? That we need to all sort of sing in one chorus, right? In harmony to immerse people in the values and narratives that we actually want to amplify. So ask yourself, who are the people or groups that you have to connect with in order to align on and amplify a shared narrative? If you are in the social movement building part of this ecosystem, who are your connectors to folks doing research, to folks doing comms, to artists and creatives, right? Who can actually build those actual bridges for you? And how do you all then work in harmony or sing in harmony from the same narrative songbook? Questions to ask yourself as you're designing out your narrative. Next slide. All right, and then finally, once y'all are all together in conversation, what are the actual stories and messages you want to uplift, right? You don't want to reiterate, have to, disprove your oppo's stories. There should be ones that for you actually tap into your audiences and make them feel good, but also like they actually can, do something about it, right? We gotta actually get comfortable with identifying art, culture, media that is emotionally resonant. And again, that takes knowing your audience, right? Their tastes, their beliefs, their habits, who they trust as a messenger, and so on. I want to shout out the race class narrative folks over at We Met the Future, who have been helping folks to share narrative in an easy, accessible, and influential way. They have been great at having folks understand values, villains, vision, and victory. Boom, right? As an easy package way to share your narrative. All right, Dennis, next slide. So some examples, right? How are folks actually doing this in real time? Remember, our goal is to create narratives that neutralize our opposition and break through with, things that actually compel people, right? And so your role is to unearth and cultivate and spread narrative stories that are culturally relevant and change folks' worldview. For example, in Dallas, on the left side, you'll see folks from Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, which is a grassroots group based out of Dallas. And they use research, art, and culture to elevate histories of racism across the DFW area. They've been, conducting bus tours that can take folks through the history, the geography of Dallas to unearth histories of racial terror and discrimination. On the right side, you have the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama, by EJI. And they have gathered soil from across the country as a reminder of the many lives, named or unnamed, lost to the violent history of lynching and other racialized terror, such as mass incarceration that extends from the past into the present. Next slide. Or through art, right? This is art from James Garden. And you can actually use art to counter hateful white nationalist ideologies and envision a common good politics or solidarity dividend through art, right? And media and music. Next slide. Journalists can also be of use, right? They can work in parallel or directly with social movements and organizations to elevate stories of interconnectedness and solidarity. It doesn't have to always be, doom and gloom. They could talk about how immigrants can help revive small towns, how, you can explore alternatives to housing, whether it be co-housing, whether it be, opening up homes, whether it be social housing, right? There are avenues forward. Next slide. And then very quickly, I want to share the story too from Heather McGee, author of Some of Us and past president of Demos. That's a good example of, drain pool politics versus solidarity dividend. On the left side, we have a pool of Oak Park Pool, right? Thinking back to the 50s and 60s during integration, right, that period of time. There were folks who were adamantly against integrating pools, parks, and what have you, and would rather drain them and close them than see folks of different races and colors together, right? That was a loss for everybody, not just Black people. And now there is no pool in this community. Whereas on the right side, we have Swoop Park Pool in Kansas City, Missouri, where for a time the pool was closed for similar reasons. But folks in this community, right, across race, waged a legal battle and pushed for the pool to be reopened. They wanted to swim, right? And to this day, that pool is open, just highlighting, right, the costs that we have, the choices we have, right? We can either lean into drain pool politics, where we all lose out on public goods and resources and things we need for our communities, or we could find the courage across race, stand together and advance racial and gender equity that then benefits all of us. Dennis, back to you.
Thanks, Jane. I love that last story. And if you all haven't checked out Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, please do. And she also has a podcast where she talks about these stories in particular. And so a couple of additional examples that we want to leave you with before we open it up with Q&A. Wanted to talk about the ways in which artists and cultural workers are lifting up what we also are interrogating ourselves at Race Forward. How do we lift up the importance and purpose of public goods and also government? And so this is a story, what you see here, this is a story about artist Alfredo Jahr. He was commissioned to create an art installation by a Swedish mill town whose main source of revenue is timber, and the largest employer is a paper mill. He built something he called the 24-hour museum, a gallery made entirely of locally sourced paper and lumber that featured only the works of local artists. And so people, they came near and far to be able to see it. And they asked, why is it called the 24-hour museum? And he said it was going to be burned to the ground after 24 hours. And the locals were like, excuse me, what? And so they protested, they tried to petition the museum to no avail, right? They even talked to the fire department to be like, hey, can you be here when they burn this down? And so at the end of the 24 hours, though, at the end of that, he was successful in actually burning this museum down. And then you fast forward to the punchline. The mayor called the artist, Alfredo Jahr, a few months after the event and commissioned him to build a permanent public art museum. The locals got organized it. They demanded that some of their tax dollars be redirected to the arts. And so today the town has a permanent art museum for local artists to display their work that also serves as a monument to collective action and public purpose. And this last example that we wanted to share with you all is, how do we even narrate government's role and responsibility, its purpose to steward public good? We can certainly do that through our messages, and race class narrative does a really good job of helping you emphasize, for example, government for the common good. And you'll be able to hear a little bit about that in the next session when you talk about when the folks here talk about the housing justice narrative research that was done a few years ago. But I also wanted to lift up work like Parks and Recreation or Abbott Elementary, stories of public servants stewarding public goods, of showing even just their conditions and the purpose of it. And so we have a couple of other examples specifically on housing, but just wanted to say, and Jane and I, we have been in partnership with other organizations, namely Community Change and Policy Link, to think about how do you all integrate this into your work, and specifically housing justice, and how can artists and cultural workers lift that up, particularly amongst persuadables and base, as Jane said earlier. And so a couple of things, Jane and I, we went through, this is usually like a full day workshop, if not 4 hours, we fit it into 4 hours before. And we just gave you a ton of information and your brain is probably just swimming with so many ideas. Some of the things that Jane and I do at Race Forward, and also in partnership with other organizations, we do a longer version of this training. We do coaching, we do producing. We help connect you to do audience research. Some of you may already be connected to organizations that are doing this for you. Who are the base? Who are your persuadables? What are they into? What media are they engaging with? What artists are they listening to? What we also do is narrative alignment. Jane kept on saying, and I love this, how do we sing in harmony so that narratives around interdependence, around the solidarity dividend, around the public become deeply felt? You need alignment, and that requires a lot of facilitation, a lot of convening to even agree. What are those narratives that we want to align on? And then the last couple of things, how do you work with artists and cultural workers? There's good ways to work with them, and there are bad ways. And I think one of the things that we want to make sure we lead the field with is, okay, well, then how do you come correct? Particularly when artists and storytellers often get exploited by institutions. And then the last two ones are also things that we specialize in and other partners that we work with, whether it's making the case in your organization or to your funders for narrative and cultural strategy work. And also one place where we are thinking about more deeply, which is how do you measure impact, right? Not just wins on a campaign, which are incredibly important and certainly one indicator, but how do you actually measure culture change? That's an interesting set of questions that we're diving deep into. And so with that, we have arrived at our Q&A. Would love to hear some comments, some questions. Again, the slides should be in your packet. And if not, we are going to make sure that we make that available to you. And Jane and I are also available even after the next couple of minutes, whether through email or through our friends at Neighborhood Partnerships, to be able to answer any burning questions that you have.
All right. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions if we can do it lightning round. If you would like Dennis and Jane to be able to see you, there is a mic over there with a camera in front of it, and you can go over there and ask your question. But for accessibility reasons, we also have NP staff walking around with microphones. I see a few mics in the room. So if you have a question for Dennis or Jane, if you could raise your hand and we'll make sure a mic gets to you. The back. A mic is running its way over to you. Okay, question or comment? Here we go.
Just a comment. When you were talking about where is your reconstruction, I would like to know how you incorporate the American Indian into that. Most of your history was on Black history, but as you all know, and we all know, Native Americans were here on this continent and turned all them first. So that's just a comment, and I'd like to hear from the facilitators on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jane, maybe if you had anything, I can start, and if you have anything to share. I didn't catch your name, but thank you so much for that comment. I think the history and reality of Indigenous erasure is real. And as I said earlier, the political context is you can't even talk about that in our classrooms. And so we absolutely need to make that visible. And I think one of the other pieces that we also want that I mentioned in our presentation that is an area of inquiry are the ways in which, as I said, these values that lead us to our liberation, we didn't just come up with them ourselves, like interdependence, around dignity, around safety or belonging. What we've learned being in relationship with Native organizers is that those have been a part of Indigenous cultures for so long. Turns out the keys to our liberation have been here, and they have been actively suppressed and exploited and marginalized by white supremacy, right? We are told instead that individuality is the way to freedom, when we know in our experience that has been false, right? And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done in partnership, right? To figure out the ways in which those values and deep narratives come to life, and how Indigenous cultures are actually showing the way towards liberation, have been, if we are willing to make that visible and uplift Native voices too.
Yeah,
Jane, did you want to add anything to that?
I think you said it really well, but yeah, you said it all more or less.
I think the one other thing, and I've always been curious about this too, it's like we talk about democracy a lot, right? And then of course, when you talk about democracy, oftentimes you go to founding fathers. But I think an area of inquiry, which we have been increasingly interested in, is even those founding fathers looked towards other people and cultures to model a constitutional government. And one of those was the Iroquois Confederacy, right? And so I think and I just say this just to be completely transparent, one of the things that we have been trying to do around our narrative building is even to move away from a founding fathers framework, which again centers, those white men, but erases the histories and cultures that informed how they even thought about a democracy. Right. For me, I'm very tired of having to name the hypocrisy of it and want to go and just say that there are other cultures and communities and tribal nations in particular that have already had been thinking about this well before the founding fathers.
We have our next question lined up. You can.
Oh, if I go over there, they can see me?
No, you'd have to walk all the way over there.
We can hear you.
I want you to see me.
Oh, thank you. I love seeing, it was one of the hardest things to present is to talk and say the words when you can't see people. So thank you for walking up to the camera.
A face.
I'm Michael, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I really like what you guys said about storytelling. I really believe in the power of storytelling. I think one of you guys mentioned something about remembering childhood stories. You can remember stories from your childhood, but I bet you most people can't remember the last PowerPoint presentation they heard. And also about the connection with culture into our neighborhoods. In Portland, I live in an area in Northeast Portland that to me is not only a food desert, but it's a cultural desert. And storytelling to me is a way to lift up voices of the community and to empower people. The problem is that we live in a cultural desert and we don't have, the moth coming into our neighborhood and doing storytelling. So this is more of a comment than a question, but I want to find a way to really enhance the cultural aspect. There is an organization in Portland that's spending $90 million in the area that I live in, but it's mostly around brick and mortar. They want to build buildings. And to me, I grew up in New York City, and to me, New York City is not made of brick and mortar. It's made of millions of stories of people, of immigrants that came there and made it what it is. And I just don't see that happening with a lot of the nonprofits that are really trying to solve some of the housing injustice in Portland. I see them more focused on building buildings and, but what really I don't see the emphasis on enhancing culture in those areas. And maybe you could comment on that.
For sure. I mean, you're saying a lot there. I definitely know, personally as being a former renter organizer, myself, right? The emphasis on buildings and not on people. I think one thing, you mentioned New York, and I'm also from New York City. Go New Yorkers. Is that there are a variety of ways, even within a space that can feel like a cultural desert, to uplift those stories. I think about Humans of New York, for example, right? Which started as a page with a photo and a story, trying to share the lives of people who walk around New York. What does it actually look like to have a Humans of Portland or something similar to that? Trying to uplift the lived experiences of people in Portland, who are tenants of a variety of types. Maybe they're living as a renter. Maybe they are trying to, hold on to their home, pay their mortgage, right? But it's hard. Maybe it's folks who are, housing insecure and are going through bouts of homelessness, right? How do you actually, create the platforms, even as small to, share those stories and make them feel real and close to people during their very busy and hectic days and lives, right? That can be done and definitely could be an intervention that you utilize to focus not just on buildings, but also on people.
Yeah. And I would add a couple of things. We talk a lot about building cultural infrastructure, public art jobs, for example, and we can do that in a way that advances equity and does not, right? And I know a lot of cities are thinking about this. I would also encourage us to be careful when we talk about this. Let me use another example. I was around in New York City when I heard a re-narration of food deserts to food apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why they made that shift was we had to be careful, right? Deserts, that implication was that there wasn't already good work or strengths in those areas. And in fact, if you went deeper into some of those neighborhoods, there were leaders and organizers that were starting community gardens that have been saying these things for years and have been trying to build systems like food co-ops, for example, for food justice, to have healthy, sustainable, affordable food in those neighborhoods. And so I think, when I think about cities like Portland or really any place across the country, is to always think about, to always know that those communities that have been struggling, that have been excluded from access and opportunity, in this case, to cultural assets and opportunities, I bet that they've been there for many years, if not decades. And I think what we want to encourage, and this gets to the point around advancing equity and cultural infrastructure, is then how do we not just platform those voices, but to resource them in a way in which they also co-own the infrastructure, right? I think that is a really interesting conversation, right? It's not building infrastructure for them, but how do we catalyze the opportunities and connections that we have so that communities most excluded from these systems own it, right? Own that media infrastructure, own that arts and cultural infrastructure, get to the point where they can then apply to government funds, can apply to funding, all of those things. That is, for us, a really critical piece. And then I think you're right. The last thing I'll say, because I know we're running low on time, is that, even when we are successful for implementing policy that advances housing justice, right? Like whether it's rent control or, like rolling back single family housing, the list goes on, right? Like there's lots of policy solutions. Unless we are concurrently building the narrative and cultural strategy that accompanies it, we have seen those policies get rolled back time and time again because of the other side, those that represent moneyed interests, for example, end up just in a backlash moment, reifying those same narratives. Like, why are we giving housing opportunities for people that didn't work for it, quote unquote, right? And that's what happens in backlash moments. And so it is just increasingly important for us to use all the tools at our disposal, not just messages, but stories, arts and culture, to reinforce our ideas and narratives around justice and equity and inclusion over time. Let's make it exciting, popular, and deeply felt, and engage all the storytellers in our neighborhoods to be able to do that, centering those that are most impacted by those systems. But I'll just say, everybody has a story to tell. Even mine that you heard earlier is one of privilege. And for me, I am just like, this is how it was created. I am making that visible. For those of you who have a similar story, I encourage you to tell it too. Don't take up all the space in telling your story, but we need you to share your story with other folks that have been in similar circumstances so that they too, like me, like us, can choose the path of equity and justice. That choice is available. Let's tell stories that show that choice visibly and explicitly. Yay.
Yay.
Thank you, everyone. I wish we could be there in that room with you. I said that earlier.
I know.
Appreciate that we could do this across the coasts, but I just wish, but it's good to be here nonetheless.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Jane. And want to uplift something that Jane said in terms of the enormity or how big this can feel, is that this is really work in service to our souls. and that multi-generational, long-term, ancestral and future visioning work. And so I just really wanted to uplift that and thank both of you for being here. And as Dennis said, I think that they'll stick around. So if you do have a question that you didn't get to ask, the camera now we know is all the way over there. But I will be transitioning you all to your next session options. And in terms of slides, all of the content from the plenaries and slides that you will see at reconference will be emailed to you. So you don't have a folder or something that you forgot to pick up at the check-in. All of that will be sent to your email. And so just look for that there. In terms of the next sessions, the housing session will be in Willamette Room A, and the economic justice session will be in Willamette Room B. And I have a brief announcement regarding translation. We had some miscommunication and we now have it available, but I will say that in Spanish now so that it is accessible. Para la siguiente sesión tuvimos una equivocación para el equipaje para traducir, pero ahora lo tenemos, discúlpenos, pero va a estar disponible en la casa